On September 30th, 1946, judges at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg delivered a verdict that transformed hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had considered themselves elite warriors into members of a criminal organization, declaring that the entire SS, including its military branch, the Waffen-SS, had been a key instrument of Nazi crimes, and that simply belonging to the organization could constitute a crime under international law. The ruling shocked former Waffen-SS members across defeated Germany who had surrendered just 16 months earlier, expecting to be treated as prisoners of war like regular Wehrmacht soldiers, but who now faced denazification tribunals, potential prosecution, and a future where their black uniforms and death's head insignia made them symbols of terror rather than military pride. Yet within less than a decade, many of these same men who had been declared war criminals at Nuremberg would be collecting government pensions, working in West German factories and offices, and organizing into a powerful lobbying group that convinced politicians to declare they had been soldiers like any other, demonstrating how quickly political pragmatism and Cold War necessity could override moral judgment and transform Germany's most ideologically committed Nazi fighters from criminals into pensioners whose wartime service the new democratic state chose to forgive, if not forget. The story of the Waffen-SS after 1945 reveals how a force that had numbered nearly 1 million men at the height of Nazi power dissolved into scattered individuals facing judgment or obscurity, how the Cold War's political calculations allowed many to rebuild normal lives despite their service in an organization built on racial ideology and violence, and how their decades-long campaign to rehabilitate their reputation as apolitical soldiers rather than ideological warriors created myths that persist even today when scholars have documented beyond doubt the Waffen-SS's systematic participation in mass murder and genocide. The surrender and reckoning. In May 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed under the weight of Soviet offensives from the east and Anglo-American advances from the west, hundreds of thousands of Waffen-SS soldiers laid down their arms across Europe, surrendering to Allied forces that viewed them with particular suspicion, given their reputation for fanaticism and brutality earned through 5 years of warfare on every front. Units that had once been celebrated as Hitler's elite, from the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler that had served as the Führer's bodyguard to Das Reich that had massacred French civilians at Oradour-sur-Glane, now found themselves prisoners of war herded into improvised camps, where Allied authorities began the process of separating regular Wehrmacht soldiers from SS members who wore distinctive uniforms and bore blood group tattoos that identified them as part of Heinrich Himmler's organization. The Allied powers issued orders for the total dissolution of the SS and all its branches, recognizing that unlike the regular German army, which could be viewed as a conventional military force that had fought for its country, the SS represented the ideological core of Nazi Germany and had been created specifically to implement Hitler's racial policies and maintain the regime through terror. American, British, and Soviet troops rounded up Waffen-SS members regardless of rank or unit, marching them into captivity, while intelligence officers compiled lists identifying officers who might be prosecuted for war crimes and determining which units had participated in atrocities that violated the laws of war, even by the standards of the brutal conflict that had just ended. Conditions in post-war camps were harsh, as Allied authorities struggled to manage millions of prisoners of war and displaced persons across a devastated continent. Many Waffen-SS prisoners were kept in improvised enclosures under open sky, facing disease, hunger, and uncertainty about their futures as rumors spread about trials and executions that awaited those accused of specific crimes. Allied forces overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge, focused on identifying high-ranking officers and members of units known to have committed massacres, while the vast majority of lower-ranking soldiers waited in camps, wondering whether they would face prosecution or eventual release. The legal reckoning came swiftly at Nuremberg, where prosecutors assembled evidence demonstrating that the SS had been far more than a military organization, that it had served as the instrument through which Nazi Germany implemented its racial policies, including the Holocaust, and that Waffen-SS units had systematically murdered civilians, executed prisoners of war, and participated in anti-partisan operations that made no distinction between combatants and innocent populations. The trials that began in November 1945 heard testimony from survivors describing massacres committed by Waffen-SS divisions across occupied Europe, from the murder of American prisoners at Malmedy in Belgium to the destruction of entire villages in the Soviet Union, where SS units had killed every inhabitant as part of Hitler's racial war. When the tribunal declared the SS a criminal organization on September 30th, 1946, the judgment carried profound implications for hundreds of thousands of former Waffen-SS members who now faced the possibility that their service itself constituted a crime. The ruling included some exceptions, acknowledging that conscription had increased after 1943 as Germany's manpower needs grew desperate, and that some men had been drafted into Waffen-SS units without understanding the organization's ideological nature. But the basic verdict remained that the SS had been created for criminal purposes, and that its members bore collective responsibility for the crimes committed in its name. Denazification and division. Denazification courts sprang up across occupied Germany, sorting millions of former Nazis and German soldiers into categories ranging from major offenders who faced prosecution to followers who received minor penalties or were cleared entirely. For Waffen-SS members, the verdicts depended heavily on rank, theater of service, and the political climate in their local zone of occupation, creating inconsistencies where men from the same unit might receive dramatically different judgments based on where they happened to be processed. A few well-known figures faced military tribunals for specific atrocities, including SS Brigade Führer Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS Panzer Division, who was tried and imprisoned for ordering the execution of Canadian prisoners in France, while others faced prosecution for their roles in massacres across Italy, the Balkans, and the Eastern Front, where Waffen-SS units had compiled records of extraordinary brutality. But the vast majority of lower-ranking Waffen-SS soldiers were released within months of the war's end, their records marked with their SS service, but their lives largely intact, as overwhelmed Allied authorities determined that prosecuting hundreds of thousands of men for organization membership alone was neither practical nor legally sustainable. Many returned to towns and villages across Germany and Austria that had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing, finding homes destroyed, economies collapsed, and societies struggling with hunger and displacement as millions of refugees fled territories lost to Poland and the Soviet Union. The name Waffen-SS had become synonymous with fanaticism and war crimes, making employment difficult and social acceptance nearly impossible as Germans began confronting the evidence of Nazi atrocities that occupation forces revealed through mandatory visits to concentration camps and public displays of photographs documenting the Holocaust. For those who chose flight, rather than face uncertain futures in occupied Germany, sympathetic networks provided forged documents and escape routes that took former SS officers to South America, the Middle East, and other regions where new identities and European military experience made them valuable assets. Karl Nicolucci Leck, a former panzer commander, reached Argentina in 1948, where he built a quiet life under Juan Perón's regime that welcomed skilled Germans regardless of their wartime activities, while similar routes took fugitives to Spain, where Franco's fascist government protected them, to Syria and Egypt, where former SS officers found employment training Arab armies, and to other destinations where Cold War politics made anti-communist Germans more valuable than war crimes prosecutions. These escapes fueled stories of Nazi rat lines organized by sympathetic clergy or intelligence services seeking to recruit experienced officers for new conflicts, claims that remain partly documented through declassified records and partly debated by historians examining the complex networks that facilitated these flights. The Rehabilitation Campaign. The creation of the Federal Republic of Germany in May 1949 marked a turning point for former Waffen-SS members who had spent 4 years stigmatized as war criminals and excluded from the modest benefits that other German veterans began receiving as the new democratic state established itself under Allied supervision. The country's first leaders faced the challenge of rebuilding a society that included hundreds of thousands of former Nazi Party members and soldiers whose participation in the regime made them politically toxic, but whose reintegration seemed necessary for stability and democratic consolidation. For Western allies, whose initial stance had been that the Waffen-SS remained a criminal organization whose members deserved no recognition or benefits, the deepening Cold War created new calculations where stability in West Germany mattered more than strict denazification, and where anti-communist Germans became potential allies rather than defeated enemies requiring punishment. By the early 1950s, political debates over veteran welfare dominated the Bundestag as conservative politicians recognized that hundreds of thousands of former soldiers and their families represented a significant voting bloc whose support could determine election outcomes. The introduction of the Bundesversorgungsgesetz, the Federal War Victims Relief Act of 1950, ignited fierce controversy over whether Waffen-SS members should receive benefits like regular Wehrmacht soldiers despite the Nuremberg verdict that had declared their organization criminal. Conservative politicians, including Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, eventually agreed that excluding Waffen-SS veterans would risk alienating voters and creating a resentful population that might turn to extremist parties, leading to the decision that men who could demonstrate post-1943 conscription rather than voluntary enlistment could claim limited pensions and benefits. The turning point came in 1953 when Adenauer publicly declared that the men of the Waffen-SS had fought as soldiers just like others, a statement that carried enormous symbolic weight by signaling West Germany's quiet shift toward normalizing Waffen-SS service as part of the broader military experience, rather than maintaining the distinction that Nuremberg had drawn between ideological warriors and conventional soldiers. The statement reflected political calculations more than historical judgment. As Adenauer's government faced tight elections and needed to mobilize conservative voters who sympathized with veterans regardless of which uniform they had worn. But it provided former SS members the official recognition they had sought and opened the door to broader rehabilitation. In 1951, former Waffen-SS generals Paul Hauser, Otto Kumm and Felix Steiner founded HIAG, the Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, translated as the Mutual Aid Association of Former Waffen-SS Members, an organization that began as a welfare group helping comrades denied state benefits, but quickly evolved into a political and historical lobby dedicated to rehabilitating the Waffen-SS's reputation. The founders were articulate former senior officers who believed their organization had been unfairly condemned at Nuremberg and who promoted a simple but powerful narrative claiming that the Waffen-SS had been an apolitical fighting force composed of soldiers who fought bravely for Germany without knowledge of or participation in the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes. HIAG's lobbying found receptive audiences among conservative politicians seeking veteran votes, with Adenauer meeting privately with its leaders and prominent figures like Franz Josef Strauss addressing veteran rallies where former SS members gathered to commemorate their wartime service and demand recognition from the state they had fought to defend. By the mid-1950s, HIAG claimed tens of thousands of members organized in branches across West Germany, published magazines, including Der Freiwillige, that featured memoirs portraying SS divisions as elite military units rather than ideological forces, and financed the publication of books like Hauser's 1953 Soldaten wie andere, that became the cornerstone of the myth that Waffen-SS members had been soldiers like any other, despite overwhelming evidence of their systematic participation in war crimes. The organization's influence peaked in the 1960s when some former SS officers secured public positions, and commemorative events for Waffen-SS divisions received coverage in local media without significant criticism, demonstrating how successful the rehabilitation campaign had been in a country where most citizens preferred to look forward toward prosperity rather than backward toward crimes that implicated millions in supporting or tolerating the Nazi regime. When West Germany created the Bundeswehr in 1956, questions arose about whether former SS members could serve in the new Democratic Army, with official policy theoretically allowing their recruitment, but in practice accepting only a small fraction of applicants, as Allied advisors and German officials feared that too many former SS officers would taint the Bundeswehr's reputation and undermine its integration into NATO. The reckoning and legacy. The myths that HIAG promoted began facing serious challenges in the 1970s as a younger generation of Germans who had not experienced the war started questioning their parents' generation about what they had known and done during the Nazi years. Historians and journalists exposed HIAG's revisionist efforts to minimize war crimes and portray the Waffen-SS as victims of Allied propaganda, documenting through archival research and survivor testimony that Waffen-SS units had systematically murdered civilians, executed prisoners of war, and participated in anti-partisan operations that made no distinction between resistance fighters and innocent populations across occupied Europe and the Soviet Union. In 1978, a Der Spiegel investigation revealed HIAG's deep political connections and its efforts to pressure officials on pension reforms, documenting how the organization had successfully lobbied for benefits that many Germans found morally repugnant given the crimes committed by Waffen-SS units. The scandal marked a turning point as mainstream political parties began distancing themselves from an organization whose rehabilitation efforts increasingly conflicted with Germany's evolving understanding of its Nazi past and its commitment to confronting, rather than minimizing, the crimes committed in its name. Yet, HIAG remained active for another decade, sustained by aging veterans determined to defend their version of history and to insist that they had been soldiers rather than war criminals, despite the verdict delivered at Nuremberg 4 decades earlier. By the 1980s, HIAG's membership declined as age and death reduced the population of former Waffen-SS members, but the organization continued fighting battles over memorials and cemetery plaques, while anti-fascist groups protested Waffen-SS reunions that they viewed as celebrations of a criminal organization. In 1992, facing dwindling membership and public disapproval, HIAG officially dissolved, ending 41 years of organized efforts to rehabilitate the Waffen-SS's reputation and secure recognition for men who had served in an organization that Nuremberg had declared criminal. After German reunification in 1990, newly opened archives and survivor testimonies revealed in greater detail how Waffen-SS units had operated alongside security police and murder squads, disproving claims that the military branch had been separate from the SS's ideological mission. Journalists discovered that some former Waffen-SS members were still receiving state pensions under the 1950 Federal War Victims Relief Act, sparking outrage especially when reports noted that many Holocaust survivors had never received comparable compensation from the German state. Successive governments debated pension reforms, but laws rooted in post-war compromises proved difficult to undo, given constitutional protections and the legal precedents that had been established during the 1950s rehabilitation. Beyond Germany's borders, the Waffen-SS legacy took troubling forms in parts of Eastern Europe, where veterans of locally recruited SS divisions began being commemorated as freedom fighters against Soviet occupation. Annual marches in Riga honoring the 15th and 19th Latvian SS divisions drew criticism from Jewish organizations and the European Parliament, demonstrating how the Waffen-SS's image had become entangled with post-Soviet identity politics, where fighting against Stalin's regime could be portrayed as patriotic resistance despite the unit's participation in Nazi Germany's racial war. Inside Germany, authorities cracked down on far-right groups using SS symbols and imagery, viewing such displays as threats to democracy and violations of laws banning Nazi symbolism. What it meant. The transformation of Waffen-SS members from elite soldiers to war criminals declared at Nuremberg and back to pensioned veterans collecting state benefits reveals how political calculations and Cold War pragmatism overrode moral judgments about an organization that had been created to implement Nazi ideology through violence. The rehabilitation that occurred during the 1950s reflected West Germany's prioritization of stability and reintegration over justice and accountability, allowing hundreds of thousands of men who had served in a criminal organization to rebuild normal lives, while the crimes they had participated in or witnessed remained largely unexamined. HIAG's decades-long campaign to portray Waffen-SS members as apolitical soldiers succeeded in shaping public memory, despite overwhelming historical evidence that the organization had been ideologically committed to Nazism and had systematically participated in war crimes across Europe. The myths created during these years persist in some circles even today, demonstrating how easily history can be reshaped when political convenience aligns with veterans' desires to be remembered as soldiers rather than criminals. The story reminds us that confronting historical atrocities requires more than tribunals and verdicts, that societies must choose whether to prioritize moral reckoning or political expediency, and that the ease with which war criminals became pensioners in 1950s, West Germany stands as a warning about how quickly justice can be sacrificed when other priorities seem more pressing. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.